But if we blow through our good hand of cards, which involves so you interview all kinds of people at the cutting edge of technology. If we get rid of all of our university funding, so we aren't going to have the intellectual capital on which those businesses are based. If we're going to dump all our allies for unknown reasons and just alienate them so they organize without us. If we're going to...
If you were to sit in a room with Joseph Stalin, Adolf Hitler, and perhaps a typical Western politician, who do you think you would find the most pleasant company? Most of us have a caricature in our heads. We imagine Stalin as the Red Tsar, a paranoid brute who ruled solely by the bludgeon, a man who slammed his fist on the table and sent people to the Gulag at the slightest whim. We contrast him with the screaming, hysterical demagoguery of Hitler, and we assume that Stalin's power came purely from terror, from the barrel of a gun. But I'm going to offer you a counter-argument. A tour of the historical record suggests that this view is not only incomplete, it is dangerously wrong. Stalin didn't hold power for 3 decades simply because he was a thug. He held power because he was, in a twisted sense, a genius of emotional intelligence. Consider the evidence. In 1934, the famous British writer H.G. Wells visited Moscow. Wells was a Fabian socialist, yes, but he was also a critical thinker, a man who had met leaders across the globe. He went in expecting to meet a dictator. He went in expecting the man of steel. And what did he report back? He wrote, "I have never met a man more candid, fair, and honest, and to these qualities it is, and to nothing occult, that he owes his tremendous undisputed ascendancy in Russia." Wells continued, saying, "No one is afraid of him, and everybody trusts him." Think about that. This is 1934. The Great Terror is just around the corner. The famine in Ukraine has already ravaged the countryside, and yet one of the smartest men in the West sits across from Stalin and sees candor and trust. Was Wells stupid? No. Was he blind? No. He was charmed. This brings us to the core thesis. Stalin's deadliest weapon wasn't the NKVD. It wasn't the Gulag archipelago. It wasn't even the massive industrialization of the Soviet economy. Those were the tools of his power, yes. But the source of his power, the thing that allowed him to outmaneuver Trotsky, Bukharin, Zinoviev, and eventually manipulate Roosevelt and Churchill, was his terrifyingly high EQ. We tend to think of empathy as a virtue. We teach our children to be empathetic. But empathy is a neutral tool. It is the ability to understand what another person is feeling, to read their motivations, to see the world through their eyes. Normally, when you understand someone's pain, you want to help them. That is compassionate empathy. But there is another kind. Psychologists call it cold empathy or dark empathy. This is where you understand exactly what the other person is feeling, their insecurities, their desires, their fears, not to help them, but to calibrate your manipulation of them. Unlike Hitler, who sucked the oxygen out of every room he entered, talking endlessly at people, Stalin was a listener. He was quiet. He spoke softly. He had a yellow glint in his eyes that some described as tiger-like, but his demeanor was often described as modest, even self-effacing. This was his trap. He created a vacuum that others felt compelled to fill. In the Politburo meetings of the 1,920 seconds, while Trotsky was dazzling everyone with brilliant oratory and intellectual arrogance, making enemies with every sentence, Stalin sat back. He packed his pipe. He listened. He remembered who felt slighted by Trotsky. He remembered who was insecure about their revolutionary credentials. He gathered this emotional data with the precision of an accountant. And then, when he struck, he didn't strike as an enemy. He struck as a friend who was reluctantly doing what had to be done for the party. He made his victims feel that they were the ones who had betrayed the friendship, not him. Why does this matter? Why revisit the psychology of a dead dictator? Because we often mistake charisma for competence, and we mistake quietness for weakness. We are going to deconstruct the Stalin method to see that the tragedy of Russia wasn't just that a monster took over, it was that the monster was the one man who understood the Russians better than they understood themselves. He didn't just break their bones, he broke their souls by making them complicit in their own destruction. And that requires a level of psychological sophistication that we ignore at our peril. In the early 1920 seconds, the Bolshevik leadership was a shark tank of massive egos. You had Leon Trotsky, the brilliant military strategist and orator who had literally organized the revolution. You had Grigory Zinoviev, the bombastic head of the Comintern. You had Nikolai Bukharin, the beloved theorist. All of them were intellectuals. All of them loved the sound of their own voices, and all of them looked down on Joseph Stalin. They called him the Gray Blur. They called him Comrade Card Index. To them, he was a boring administrator, a man of limited imagination who was useful for filing paperwork and managing the lower rungs of the party bureaucracy. They thought he was dull, and Stalin, with his supreme emotional intelligence, let them think it. In fact, he encouraged it. This was his first great psychological coup. In a power struggle, the most dangerous person is the one you don't fear. While Trotsky was busy quoting French literature and insulting his colleagues' intelligence during Politburo meetings, Stalin was busy doing favors. He controlled the appointments. If a party member in a remote province needed a new apartment, or a promotion, or help with a family matter, they didn't go to Trotsky. Trotsky was too busy thinking about the permanent revolution. They went to Stalin. Stalin listened to their petty grievances. He remembered their birthdays. He asked about their wives. He built a vast network of emotional debt. He understood something the intellectuals missed. Politics isn't just about ideas, it's about people. And people are driven by gratitude, resentment, and the need to be heard. By the time the great men realized what was happening, the gray blur had quietly replaced the entire foundation of the party with men who owed their careers and their loyalty personally to him. Consider the master class of manipulation that occurred around Lenin's funeral in 1924. This was the moment the succession would be decided. Trotsky was away in the south, recovering from an illness. Stalin sent him a telegram with the wrong date for the funeral, telling him he couldn't make it back in time and should stay put to recover. It was a lie, but a plausible one. So, while Trotsky was absent, looking arrogant and disrespectful to the beloved leader, Stalin was front and center. He positioned himself as the chief mourner, the humble disciple carrying Lenin's coffin. He delivered an oath to Lenin that sounded almost religious in its devotion. He wasn't trying to be the new genius. He was signaling to the party, I am just the servant of Lenin's legacy. I am the safe pair of hands. This resonated deeply with the rank-and-file members. They were tired of the chaotic brilliance of the intellectuals. They wanted stability. Stalin read that collective emotional exhaustion perfectly. He presented himself as the golden center, the moderate, reasonable man standing between the extremes of the left and the right. He formed a triumvirate with Zinoviev and Kamenev to block Trotsky. These two men thought they were using Stalin to get rid of their rival. They thought Stalin was their junior partner. They had no idea that he was studying them, feeding their vanity, and waiting for the moment they would become expendable. He played the role of the peacemaker, often pretending to defend Trotsky against the harshest attacks, saying things like, "We must not be too rough with Comrade Trotsky," even as he orchestrated his political isolation. It creates a terrifying cognitive dissonance. How do you fight an enemy who defends you in public? How do you attack a man who seems to have no ambition other than serving the party? Stalin's genius was that he didn't make it about him, he made it about the cause. If you opposed Stalin, you weren't opposing a man. You were opposing party unity. You were creating a faction. And in the Bolshevik mindset, creating a faction was a mortal sin. By the late 1920 seconds, the gray blur had sharpened into something much harder, but his victims still didn't see the knife coming. They were too busy arguing with each other, manipulated by a man who knew exactly which buttons to push to make them destroy themselves. But the real test of his dark empathy was yet to come when he would turn this psychological weapon against the entire Soviet peasantry. By 1928, the mask of the moderate Golden Center fell away, and Stalin revealed the full extent of his ambition. He did something that shocked his former allies on the right. He stole the clothes of the left. He adopted the very policies of rapid industrialization that Trotsky had preached, but he implemented them with a ferocity that Trotsky had never dared to imagine. This was the beginning of the Great Break, the war against the peasantry. And here lies the most disturbing aspect of Stalin's emotional intelligence. He understood that to make decent people commit atrocities, you don't appeal to their cruelty. you appeal to their idealism. Stalin knew that the Communist Party, especially the younger generation, was starving for a crusade. They were tired of the compromises of the new economic policy. They wanted to build the utopia they had been promised. Stalin gave them that purpose. He framed the collectivization of agriculture not as an economic policy, but as a military campaign against a hidden enemy, the kulak. By inventing the category of the kulak, the rich, hoarding peasant Stalin tapped into the deep-seated envy and class resentment of the rural poor. But more importantly, he gave the party cadres a moral license to be brutal. He told them, "We are surrounded by capitalist enemies. If we do not modernize in 10 years, they will crush us." He created a siege mentality where mercy was equated with treason. Young urban communists flooded the countryside, convinced they were warriors of light fighting the forces of darkness. They stripped peasants of their grain, their livestock, and their dignity, all while believing they were saving the revolution. Stalin didn't have to force them. He had manipulated their internal moral compass so that pity became a bourgeois weakness to be exterminated. But the true genius of his manipulation came in March 1930. The collectivization drive had been so brutal, so chaotic, that the country was on the brink of a total peasant uprising. Any other leader might have panicked or doubled down on the violence. Stalin did neither. He did something that leaves psychologists breathless to this day. He published an article in Pravda titled "Dizzy with Success." In it, he claimed that the collectivization was a smashing success, but, and here is the twist, he blamed the local officials for being too zealous. He accused them of forcing peasants into collectives against the party's wishes. He wrote, "Who needs these excesses? They only annoy the peasant and discredit the party." It was a masterclass in gaslighting. These officials had done exactly what Stalin had secretly ordered them to do. They had met the quotas he set, but now, publicly, he hung them out to dry. The effect on the peasantry was miraculous. They cut the article out of the newspaper and treated it like a holy text. They said, "Stalin didn't know. The Tsar is good. It is the boyars who are evil." Stalin instantly regained his popularity with the masses as their protector, while the local officials, the ones who had dirtied their hands for him, were left confused, terrified, and utterly dependent on his mercy to keep their jobs. He had managed to implement a horrific policy, deflect all the blame onto his subordinates, and emerge as the hero of the story. This created a terrifying dynamic within the party. You could never be sure if you were following the correct line. If you were too soft, you were a saboteur. If you were too hard, you were dizzy with success. The only safety lay in total, unquestioning obedience to Stalin's person, not his policies. He had broken the backbone of the party's independent thinking. They were no longer colleagues, they were accomplices, bound to him by the blood they had spilled and the lies they had swallowed. And now that he had the party in a psychological stranglehold, he was ready to turn his gaze inward, to the old Bolsheviks who still remembered the days before he was a god. By the mid-1930s, Stalin faced a problem that brute force alone could not solve. The old Bolsheviks, men like Bukharin, Zinoviev, and Kamenev, were still alive. They were the founding fathers of the revolution. They knew the truth about Stalin. They remembered him when he was just a minor functionary, and they knew where the bodies were buried because they had helped him bury them. As long as they lived, Stalin's rewritten history of himself as Lenin's sole heir was vulnerable. To secure his legacy, he didn't just need them dead. He needed them discredited. He needed them to stand up in open court before the world press and confess to crimes so absurd, spying for Japan, plotting to kill Lenin, poisoning the food supply that it defied logic. And this is where the Stalin method reached its psychological zenith. Historians often attribute the confessions of the show trials to torture. And make no mistake, the NKVD used sleep deprivation and beatings liberally. But torture produces false confessions that are often retracted the moment the pain stops. These men were hardened revolutionaries. They had survived Tsarist prisons and Siberian exile. Pain alone does not explain why they stood in the Hall of Columns and delivered eloquent, carefully rehearsed speeches demanding their own execution. Stalin broke them not by attacking their bodies, but by attacking their identity. He turned their own religion against them. For a Bolshevik, the party was not just a political organization, it was the embodiment of history itself. The party could not be wrong. If the party said the sky was green and you saw blue, your eyes were counter-revolutionary. Stalin's interrogators used this dark empathy to corner their victims. They would say, "Comrade, we know you didn't actually spy for the Germans, but the party is in danger. Fascism is rising. We need to unite the people. We need to show them that there are enemies everywhere, so they will work harder and fight harder. Your final service to the revolution is to be the black sheep. Unless you confess, you are putting your own ego above the survival of the Soviet state." It was a diabolical trap. To prove their loyalty to the party, they had to lie and destroy themselves. Stalin knew that men like Bukharin loved the revolution more than they loved their own lives. He exploited that love. He weaponized their highest virtue, loyalty, and turned it into the instrument of their suicide. Consider the heartbreaking correspondence of Nikolai Bukharin during his final days. He wrote letter after letter to Stalin, addressing him by his old nickname, Koba. He wrote, "Koba, why do you need me to die?" He wasn't writing to a monster. He was writing to an old friend, believing until the very end that there was a misunderstanding, or that Stalin was being misled by the secret police. Stalin let him believe it. He kept Bukharin's letters in his desk drawer. He reportedly allowed Bukharin to keep his hope alive just enough to extract the confession, playing the role of the distant, perhaps sympathetic, but ultimately hand-tied leader. When Bukharin finally confessed, he didn't just admit to crimes, he validated Stalin's entire worldview. He effectively said, "If Stalin is the party, and I am against Stalin, then I must be a criminal." This was the ultimate victory of Stalin's EQ. He didn't just kill his rivals, he made them complicit in their own murder. He made them participate in the theater of their own destruction because he understood that for them, political death was more terrifying than physical death. He allowed them to die believing they were serving the cause, when in reality, they were only serving him. With the old guard gone, Stalin was now free to turn his psychological warfare outward, toward the leaders of the free world, who had no idea what kind of man they were about to meet. In August 1939, the world witnessed the geopolitical equivalent of an earthquake. The Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, sworn ideological enemies, representing the polar opposites of the political spectrum, signed a non-aggression pact. To the outside observer, it was madness. How could the leader of the international communist movement shake hands with the arch-enemy of the working class? But if we view this through the lens of Stalin's emotional intelligence, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was not an aberration. It was a masterpiece of cold, calculating psychology. Stalin had spent the late 1,930 seconds watching the Western democracies, Britain and France, with growing contempt. He saw their behavior at Munich, where they handed Czechoslovakia to Hitler on a silver platter. He read their hesitation not as a desire for peace, but as a sign of terminal weakness and duplicity. Stalin was convinced that the West was trying to trick him. He believed that Chamberlain and Daladier wanted to push Hitler eastward, hoping the Nazis and the Soviets would bleed each other dry while the West watched from the sidelines. Stalin's EQ was highly attuned to betrayal, largely because he was a master of it himself. He decided to flip the script. By siding with Hitler, he would turn the German war machine back toward the West. He would let the capitalist powers destroy each other, and he would step in at the end to pick up the pieces. The negotiations in Moscow revealed Stalin's chameleon-like ability to adapt his persona. When the German foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, arrived, Stalin didn't act like the stern Bolshevik ideologue. He acted like a pragmatic statesman. He knew exactly what the Germans wanted: raw materials and a guarantee of a one-front war. He gave it to them, but at a high price: half of Poland and a sphere of influence in the Baltic states. During the signing ceremony, Stalin performed a piece of psychological theater that left Ribbentrop stunned. The man who had spent years denouncing fascism raised a glass of vodka and proposed a toast. "I know how much the German nation loves its Führer. I should like to drink to the health of this great man." It was a gesture of shocking cynicism, but it worked. It convinced the Germans that Stalin was a man they could do business with, a fellow predator who respected power, not a moralist bound by principles. However, this is also where Stalin's emotional intelligence encountered its fatal blind spot. High EQ allows you to read people, but it is often limited by your own worldview. Stalin was a rational psychopath. He used terror for specific political ends. He assumed Hitler was the same. He looked at Hitler and saw a mirror image, a ruthless, transactional dictator who would act in his own rational self-interest. Stalin calculated that Hitler would never be foolish enough to invade Russia while still fighting Britain. It would be suicide. It would be a two-front war, the very mistake that lost Germany the First World War. Stalin respected Hitler's intelligence too much. He projected his own rationality onto a man who was, at his core, an irrational fanatic driven by racial destiny, not geopolitical logic. For nearly 2 years, Stalin played the role of the loyal ally, sending trainloads of grain and oil to fuel the Wehrmacht, believing he had outsmarted the world. He had bought time. He had expanded the Soviet borders. He felt secure in his psychological read of the situation. But he had made the classic error of the manipulator. He believed he was the only one playing the game. He didn't realize that while he was playing chess, Hitler was playing poker, and the German leader was about to go all in on the greatest gamble in military history. On the morning of the 22nd of June, 1941, the phone rang in the Kremlin, but for the first time in his life, the man who controlled everything was paralyzed. The German Wehrmacht had crossed the border with 3 million men, 3,000 tanks, and thousands of aircraft. It was the largest invasion in the history of warfare. And for Joseph Stalin, it wasn't just a military disaster, it was a total psychological collapse. Stalin's emotional intelligence, which had served him so well against his internal rivals, had failed him catastrophically on the world stage. He had fallen victim to the mirroring error. He was a rational psychopath, and he assumed Hitler was the same. He believed so firmly that no rational leader would start a two-front war that he ignored over 80 specific intelligence warnings. When his spies told him the Germans were massing on the border, he dismissed it as British disinformation designed to provoke a war. He was so confident in his own ability to read people that he blinded himself to the reality staring him in the face. In the first days of the war, the man of steel melted. He retreated to his dacha outside Moscow. He stopped answering the phone. He refused to lead. This is a moment historians often debate, but the psychological evidence is striking. When a delegation of the Politburo Molotov, Beria, and others drove to his dacha to see him, Stalin reportedly shrank back into his armchair. He looked at them with fear. He thought they had come to arrest him for his incompetence. He expected them to do to him what he had done to so many others. But this is where the tragedy of the Soviet system revealed itself. These men were so broken, so conditioned by years of terror and dark empathy, that they didn't come to arrest him. They came to beg him to lead them. They couldn't imagine functioning without him. Stalin realized in that moment that his control was absolute. He wasn't going to be executed. And with that realization, the panic subsided, and the master manipulator returned to work. On July 3rd, nearly 2 weeks after the invasion, Stalin finally addressed the nation on the radio, and this speech is perhaps the greatest example of his adaptive EQ. He knew that the Soviet people would not fight and die for collectivization. They wouldn't throw themselves in front of tanks for the 5-year plan or the Communist Party that had starved them. So, he changed the script entirely. He didn't open with comrades. He opened with a phrase that no one had ever heard him use. Comrades, citizens, brothers and sisters, men of our army and navy, I am addressing you, my friends, brothers and sisters. In one phrase, he pivoted from the cold, distant Bolshevik leader to a figure of religious, patriarchal warmth. He dropped the Marxist dogma and appealed directly to Russian nationalism and Orthodox spirituality. He stopped talking about the revolution and started talking about Holy Mother Russia. He summoned the ghosts of the great Tsarist generals Suvorov and Kutuzov, men the Bolsheviks had previously despised. It was a cynical, brilliant, and desperate move. He realized that to save his regime, he had to unleash the very forces he had spent 20 years suppressing: patriotism, religion, and the Russian soul. He told them, "The enemy is cruel and implacable. He is out to seize our lands, watered with our sweat." He made the war personal. He made it existential. And it worked. The Soviet people, who had every reason to hate Stalin, rallied to the defense of the motherland. They separated the man from the country. Stalin had successfully hijacked their patriotism to save his own skin. He had recovered from his psychological error by instinctively finding the only emotional lever that was strong enough to move a nation to total war. But to win that war, he would need to use his charm on a new set of targets, the leaders of the West, whom he would meet at Tehran and Yalta. By 1943, the tide of war had turned. The Red Army had broken the back of the Wehrmacht at Stalingrad. Now, Stalin had to face a different kind of battlefield, the diplomatic tables of Tehran and later Yalta. Here, he sat across from two of the most formidable politicians of the 20th century, Winston Churchill and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. If Stalin had been the frothing monster of anti-communist propaganda, these meetings would have been impossible. But he wasn't. He arrived not as a conqueror, but as Uncle Joe, a nickname that he quietly encouraged. He wore a simple marshal's uniform, spoke in a low, soft voice, and played the role of the modest, weary ally who only wanted security for his battered country. Stalin's target was Roosevelt. He had studied the American president from afar and identified his primary psychological weakness, FDR's supreme confidence in his own charm. Roosevelt believed he could seduce anyone. He told Churchill, "I think I can handle Stalin personally." Stalin, the ultimate listener, heard this and set a trap. He let Roosevelt believe that he was the one doing the charming. At Tehran, Stalin invited Roosevelt to stay at the Soviet embassy, ostensibly for security reasons. Roosevelt accepted, thinking it was a gesture of friendship. In reality, it allowed Stalin to bug every room. He listened to the president's private conversations, learning exactly what FDR wanted the United Nations and what he didn't care about Eastern European borders. Armed with this emotional intelligence, Stalin played a masterstroke. He drove a wedge between the U.S. and Britain. He knew FDR had a deep distaste for the British Empire and colonialism. So, during the meetings, Stalin would often team up with Roosevelt to mock Churchill, rolling his eyes at the Prime Minister's old-fashioned imperialism. He made Roosevelt feel like the modern, progressive partner, while isolating Churchill as the grumpy relic of the past. By the time they met at Yalta in 1945, Stalin's manipulation was total. He played the victim card with virtuosity. He constantly reminded the Western leaders that the Soviet Union had lost 27 million people. He used guilt as a weapon. How could Roosevelt and Churchill deny a security buffer to a nation that had bled so much to save them? When the topic of Poland came up, the very reason the war had started, Stalin promised free and unfettered elections. The Western leaders wanted to believe him because their voters back home needed a moral victory. They needed to believe the war wasn't just a power grab. Stalin understood that democratic leaders are slaves to public opinion, so he gave them the words they needed to sell the peace treaty at home while he kept the territory. He signed the Declaration on Liberated Europe with a flourish, knowing full well he would never implement it. When his foreign minister, Molotov, expressed worry about the document's language, Stalin reportedly smiled and said, "Do not worry. We can deal with it in our own way later." The point is the correlation of forces. He had outplayed them, not because he had more tanks, but because he understood their psychology better than they understood his. He knew they were desperate for a partner. He knew they were tired of war. So, he became exactly what they needed him to be until the moment their armies went home and the Iron Curtain slammed shut. By the early 1952, the man who had outwitted Trotsky, charmed Roosevelt, and defeated Hitler was arguably the most powerful individual in human history. He controlled an empire stretching from Berlin to Beijing, but inside the Kremlin, Stalin was a prisoner of the very psychological web he had spun. The final irony of dark empathy is that it eventually consumes the user. When you spend a lifetime anticipating betrayal, you lose the ability to recognize loyalty. Stalin began to see enemies in the shadows of his own creation. He turned on his closest circle, Molotov, Mikoyan, Beria, suspecting them of being British spies or Zionist conspirators. He launched the doctor's plot, accusing his own physicians of trying to poison the Soviet leadership. It was a projection of his own methodology. He knew that medicine could be a weapon, so he assumed everyone else was using it too. In his final years, Stalin lived in a state of weaponized isolation. He would test his guards by changing his sleeping quarters randomly. He would humiliate his dinner guests, forcing grown men to drink until they collapsed, just so he could watch them lose control. He was still gathering emotional data, still looking for the weak point, but there was no one left to fight. The Grandmaster was playing chess against himself. On the night of the 1st of March 1953, the end came not with a bang, but with a terrified silence. Stalin suffered a massive stroke in his dacha. He collapsed on the floor, unable to move or speak. And here is where the Stalin method delivered its final, fatal verdict. For hours, he lay helpless. The guards outside his door heard him fall. They might have even heard a groan, but they did not enter. Why? Because Stalin had given strict orders never to be disturbed. He had cultivated such a paralyzing fear in his subordinates that the thought of disobeying him was more terrifying than the thought of him dying. They were paralyzed by the very instinct for self-preservation that Stalin had trained into them for 30 years. It wasn't until late the next morning that anyone dared to check on him. By then, he was soaking in his own urine, half dead, his eyes full of terror but his voice gone. Even then, his inner circle hesitated to call a doctor, fearing that if Stalin recovered, he would accuse them of incompetence or assassination. The system of negative selection, where only the most sycophantic and fearful survived, meant there was no one brave enough to save the dictator's life. Joseph Stalin died on the 5th of March 1953. The man who had shaped the 20th century through the sheer force of his psychological will died a lonely, pathetic death, a victim of the terror he had perfected. So, what is the lesson for us today? Why does it matter that Stalin had high EQ? It matters because we need to update our definition of danger. We are trained to look for the screaming demagogue or the obvious bully. But history teaches us that the most dangerous leaders are often the quiet ones, the ones who listen, who charm, who understand your pain, and who use that understanding to dismantle your freedom. Stalin proved that empathy, stripped of morality, is the ultimate weapon of mass destruction. He showed us that you don't need to be a monster to do monstrous things. You just need to understand human nature well enough to break it. The Soviet Union eventually fell, collapsing under the weight of its own economic absurdity, as we discussed in our previous series. But the psychological blueprint Stalin left behind, the use of information, fear, and manufactured reality to control a population, is more relevant today than ever. The man of steel is gone, but the dark empaths are still among us, waiting for the moment we let our guard down. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the mind of a tyrant. It has been a dark road, but as always, the only way to prevent history from repeating itself is to stare it directly in the face.